When we returned from Iowa, where we had lived during the Depression, now I'm mentioning Columbia because it's where I met Phyllis. And I met Phyllis at a point in my own search when the mystical aspect of philosophy became my focal point. I realized, without being able to put it into words the way Baba does so perfectly, that the intellectual game can go on, and it does become a kind of gymnastic. And you can see it on the expressions of the professors and the students. It's so plain and evident. They just love to toss around these intellectual puzzles that have been more or less, I would say, stylized throughout all the centuries. I don't know what other intellectual questions one can ask anymore. It's just reinventing the same game all the time. And at Columbia, it was logistics and positivism. And I really didn't know what that was all about. Once, one of the students there, that was very friendly and very pleasant guy, Victor, who was a friend of Phyllis's, said, with your interest that you express in the mystics and all, I would imagine you'd enjoy meeting my friend. And he said that his friend had already written a small book on aesthetics. Now, my focal point was on ethics, and I had some passing interest in aesthetics, not very strong, because the gnawing questions of injustices and the pain that I had vicariously experienced for all these persecuted peoples was much more in the forefront. And so I said, oh, really? Aesthetics, huh? I thought, this girl's probably one of these girls that just into a kind of extrovert life. Someone who, particularly when I learned that she worked for one of the fashion magazines, I felt I'd probably meet someone who is more superficial than I was anyway. And so when finally Victor said, yes, I'm going to invite her to the class, he did, and the day I met her, she was alone outside, sitting right in front of the St. Paul Chapel, which is the university chapel, where I often sat, since it's right next door to the philosophy hall. And I had a petition to sign about something or other. I used to be somewhat of an activist on social issues, and I approached her thinking, of course she'll sign it, everyone does, but she didn't. And so I immediately got the impression, I didn't know who she was, but I had the impression of someone who stuck her nose up at some social issues. However, I went into class, and sure enough, Victor introduced me to this same girl. And I said nothing about the fact that, nor did she maybe even remember that I was the one that came by with the petition. Because she barely looked up, when I had it, because I don't think she was really interested in petitions. But when she started to comment on, and she was invited to comment, and I think it might be that she decided that she would audit the class, which would be a non-credit status, because she did come back several times. But when she started to comment, either this time or the next time, I was already very impressed. she put things into her own language, which was so readily understandable. Whereas some of the very technical and very individualistic language of each philosopher can be very confusing. I mean, if one man uses the word absolute, he might be talking about God Almighty. Someone else is talking absolute, he's talking about something totally different. Whereas when Phyllis was discussing, Alfred North Whitehead was the name of the seminar, in any case, she was on my wavelength.
Right.
And that's why I appreciated her, and we developed a friendship. And it was, again, as I have commented in other talks, that through Phyllis, that I realized that not only were there Western philosophers, but there were Eastern philosophers. And the question she once asked was, have you ever read Ramakrishna? I said, no. And I was always, really always very eager to learn, and I believe I never was afraid of expanding my horizons. So she and I went to the Ramakrishna Vivekananda Center in New York, which was where Phyllis had a very profound experience once of seeing Ramakrishna or Jesus Christ and seeing them meld into one form, and then later on realizing that that was also the face of Meher Baba. We also went to the Sufi centers, and which of course was straight Sufism.
Right.
And that was very impressive. Went to people who had various extrasensory perception gifts, and in that way, my whole perspective on this ladder of consciousness, which Baba was going to give me a much more accurate picture about, began to be established.
And now, how did Baba start to come in? Had Phyllis already heard about Baba by this time, or
no?
So it was a little later then that both of you went to Norina's talk, and that would be the.
Yes.
Now, did Victor
I think maybe about 2.5 years prior to Phyllis attending Norina's talk was the duration of our friendship.
2.5 years.
At least
really
2.5.
young.
At least.
You knew each other very well then, by.
Yes, I would say pretty well. Pretty well. We had attended prior to Baba, we had both attended a student function that was sponsored by the by American Friends Society, which is which invites students to participate in Friends activities, and the Friends of the Quakers.
Right.
So she and I had attended meetings like that out of town, so that we stayed overnight together, and that
it'd be not a seminar, but actually just a one meeting. But
no, it was more than one. Yes, it was. I would call it more like a convention.
Convention, yeah.
And then after that, I remained as a participant in one of their projects, which was to live with others and grow food for the pacifists. As you know, the Friends are pacifists, and this was during the war, so that I had joined a group that established itself somewhere in outside of Philadelphia. Remember, and our project was to rebuild a schoolhouse in a black area, rebuild part of the schoolhouse, to be specific, the roof, and to grow food and bring it to the pacifists, to the conscientious objectors.
Right.
And in that experience, I did learn a lot about meditation, because we had a very disciplined kind of program where one would get up between 5 and 6 in the morning and begin to meditate, and then go out in the garden, and then go down to, I think it was Otterbein. I don't remember exactly where this place outside of Philadelphia.
And work on the roof and put the place together?
Yes, just whatever, I had certainly not one of the supervisors, but did one of the drones.
So in all these things pretty much led to you two becoming best friends as time went on.
Yes, Phyllis was not part of that project.
Right.
Her health was not quite that, she did not have quite that much stamina.
Right.
But what she attended were the meetings, and then returned home, and I went on and stayed for, it must have been at least a week or maybe longer, on the project.
Now, your parents were happy about all the projects you were doing, and also your being at Columbia. They were quite pleased, I'd imagine. Yeah, for all that part.
I would say they had no objection. Only later they had objection. Particularly my mother, when Norina had invited us to live with them.
Now, how did that all come about? How did that start? That's another chapter now.
It was when, as you pointed out, when Phyllis had heard of the talks that were being given by a disciple of MeherBaba, namely Norina Manchabeli, and had attended, I don't know how many, just at the very beginning. She couldn't have attended more than a few, and shared that with me. As you observed, we were friends by that time, and asked me, would you enjoy hearing the disciple of she may have said of a master, and that piqued my curiosity. What is a master? I mean, of course, I don't think I was too unfamiliar with that term, but certainly Sadhguru was a little exotic, and that is how it was advertised by Norina, Sadhguru MeherBaba. And
were there flyers out, or
grasped at that opportunity.
Flyers, or was it just listed in a lecture
in the
series?
In the beginning, it was very private.
Word of mouth.
Private word of mouth. Many of the early guests were from the emigre aristocracy, and many were so-called white Russians. There was this area in New York which was really culturally dominated by the white Russians, and eventually I used to visit that area and see some of Norina's friends on her recommendation, and from them, not to deviate too much, she did have some people who caught on to Baba from that little cohort of aristocrats. Yeah.
Did you have to travel very far to these meetings that she was giving?
I did take the bus. I believe I could take the two alternatives. One could take a bus or a subway between where I lived near Columbia University and where Elizabeth had this duplex apartment on East 67th, which was in a very fine area of residences of the diplomats and people in that category of government. On this first trip, I was absolutely under a very sort of influence. I felt, other than my usual self, the influence was that I was just being guided to this meeting almost. Prior to that, I had already, that was the very first meeting. That was the very first meeting that I just had extra heartbeats and extra premonition that this was important. I couldn't quite understand it. I knew that I was just entering into something that was extremely crucial in my life, you might say. And I didn't know why I should feel that way, because all I had heard was that these are women that have returned from India, and one of them gives the message of their master, Sadguru MeherBaba. And the anticipation was correct, that it was a crucial meeting. Right. And I entered and saw first, may have been Elizabeth, I believe it was Elizabeth who greeted us first at the door, and one could only attend through invitation. And so somehow Phyllis originally had the invitation, and then she gave me the invitation, having probably asked for it. And I saw Elizabeth. Norina was already seated in the background, and she having the work to do of spiritual thought transmission. She was just probably just seated there, preparing herself for her whole embrace with Baba, you might say. I always thought of it as Baba embracing her, as she did become the most loving person I had ever met prior to Baba. At the same time, I met Nadine at one point. Right. Then I think and I was just at that meeting, very, very happy within. It was a really don't worry, be happy experience. And I pondered about it because I was a student still at Columbia, and I was taking a pretty heavy program, and it caused me a lot of stress and anxiety and a lot of mental gymnastics, and it isn't exactly a happy feeling that one has. It's an active feeling and a stimulating feeling, but this was very stimulating, nevertheless left me so peaceful and loving. My great need, as I say, and I did mention I majored in ethics, was to understand what does make people more loving and better people. And I realized that in the state established by the atmosphere in Norina's home, Elizabeth's home, Nadine's home, that one would have to be more loving. One is just automatically more loving and a better person. And so feeling like that certainly, counteracted all the skepticism that you naturally have when you're just entering into a new field of thought. And I was very impressed I told Phyllis, and she too, we both, we were not excited, nor was it anything glamorous just because we knew she was Princess Machiavelli. In fact, to the contrary. Just like I think many Americans of a certain kind are, that why retain your title of royalty when it has no place? Eventually we found out why she did. But after coming time and time again and seeing and feeling, experiencing, much more than seeing, experiencing this inflatus of increasing goodwill and love, and one was just, just captured in the best sense, because the mind is still very free, and there's no hypnotism. It's just a free choice of accepting what is making me a better person and making me more loving. All these values that are talked about so much in the various philosophical systems that I had been reading, but not really seeing it in action. In fact, some of my professors were people that I just could not admire.
Yes, certainly.
And here I was in an atmosphere where the most noble thoughts were expressed, and somehow the very atmosphere engendered that kind of action, and the people themselves. So I did continue to go there. And so did Phyllis.
What did it seem like when Princess Norina was giving the talk? What did she have facial expression, or were her eyes closed?
Yes. Yes. Oh, that is really very interesting, because the only answer I can say is it was phenomenal.
Yeah.
Phenomenal in the sense that when Norina was just Norina, relaxed and not giving messages of any sort, she was just still a very beautiful woman. She had been one of the 5 beauties of the world, and was in her 60s when we met her. She was still an elegant, beautiful woman with tremendous charm and just grace and charm. And now, when she had to play the role, I might put it that way, which was her service to Baba. And at one point, I'd like to read what Adi has said about that. She would have a different expression. Yes, she would suddenly take on a different face. The back of her head, which she wore a little bit like Baba, with that sometimes tied hair, suggestive of a bun or a ponytail. She looked like Baba in the back of her head and in the front of, in the facial expression. And it was also a transformation of voice to some extent. And powerful. One would just be captured by the atmosphere, because it just touched the heart center. Sometimes you meditate and you say you're going to focus on this third eye here, right in the center. Yeah, but over there, I would just go into the heart center, just automatically. And yet, the mind was being fed Baba from a woman of very high caliber intelligence. It was a unique opportunity for anyone. And that is what is amazing, isn't it? That's relatively few.
Yeah. It really, so it was, she would have her eyes closed, but what she was saying was very, very powerful for the mind, and yet the feeling in the room was that of love.
Oh, absolutely.
Very strong. Yeah.
So well said. Now, whether her eyes were closed all the time, Charlie, I just can't say yes or no. They were closed some of the time. Maybe they were always sort of half closed.
Right. It's sort of an interesting thing, and somewhere along here we could read Audie's thing, and also I think that'd be nice. And also I think it's interesting. Whenever we come to a new person, we might just stop for a minute and talk about that person and your experiences with that person, because this sort of opens up the field, as we slowly get more and more involved in Baba in your life.
All right. Well, she said, since I met the Master, I love him more than myself. And while I say this, I recall my experience in 1947, when after a long illness, during which all hope and joy of life had faded and all my energy had been exhausted for good or for bad, I received from the Master a cable ordering me to return to him in India. In that moment of enthusiasm created by this merciful news, I realized that even while apparently descending into a state of poverty of health and mental despair, my life had finished a turnover only to rise upwards towards its real fulfillment. My will imperatively directed me to come to India, not for myself, but for the service of the Master, that he may express himself through me. He consciously projected his thought order into me, so that he may see himself think through me. I, as his disciple, am fully conscious of this. I came to India to fulfill the dream of my life, which is to exist through him, and in him, and for him, as a living instrument for him to express himself.